Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for Resilinc's webinar about how to build supply chain resilience through better supplier assessment. My name is Melissa Geringer. I oversee corporate communications for Resilinc, and I'll be serving as moderator for today's presentation. Some quick housekeeping to start. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please use the question tab to send in your questions, and we'll do our best to cover them today or follow up with you after. Also, please know that we'll be recording the webinar and making it available to you after the broadcast. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Resilinc's Vice President of Alliances, David Chevalier. David is focused on helping our largest customers grow to enterprise scale. His background includes 14 years at IBM, one of the early executives at Dell, and managing field operations at Aruba, Juniper, and Brocade. He is joining us today from Atlanta. Welcome, David. I'll let you take it from here.
Hey, Melissa, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. With me presenting is Hirra Akhtar. Hirra is our Director of Systems Engineering, and frankly, one of the best in the business. She's out at the street level every day dealing with the issues that we're going to discuss. So if you want a credible person that knows from which she speaks, it's Hirra, and I'm delighted to be with her today. We move on and take a look at the agenda. We have a very straightforward objective, that is to share with you the value of doing supplier assessments. We have people from around the world today, some global operations, some local operations. There are about 170 people that registered, and frankly, every industry is represented. We have people from the auto, aerospace, hard goods manufacturing industries, petrol and chemicals, a very high content of education. Our observation is this curriculum is now getting into our higher education schools, and we're delighted to welcome those graduates into the market space. Kind of a new attendee, banking, finance, and insurance. And you scratch your head and say, well, they don't manufacture anything. They don't move things around the world. But at the end of the day, what we're going to learn today, it's the data. It's the data that protects us from risk. And we're going to talk about that in detail. Or as one of my insurance executive friends said, David, we have buildings and buildings and buildings of actuaries around the world that do nothing but evaluate the risk of our clients' warehouses, distribution centers, and factories for fire. We don't have a single employee that looks at our clients' supply chain risk. So this is important. He went on to say, it's gone from an afterthought to front and center. So we're going to address all of these things today, not only with assessments, but Hirra will talk extensively on developing a unified risk assessments program. There is technology available that can help you. And those of us that don't embrace the new way, we're going to be left behind, quite frankly. So let's move on a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about what's happening today. You may have seen the Wall Street Journal yesterday. I don't think you can pick up any publication, be it the Washington Post, the New York Times, but certainly yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had a fantastic article that started essentially with the message, it doesn't matter where you look on the planet, the global supply chain is a mess. We happen to agree. I mean, look at the year that we just experienced. Pick your poison off of this chart. Of course, a worldwide pandemic. Last year, more storms in recorded history than any other year. 28 named storms, 11 major hurricanes. 4 of those found their way to the United States and hit land. It seems as though the express lane is just east of the Bay of Campeche, and then it rips up through the Gulf of Mexico and lands somewhere between Brownsville, Texas, and Pensacola, Florida. Not good. Add to that the semiconductor shortage. There's now a plastic shortage. Last year, many of you may relate to this because you had suppliers in the area. There was a fire, the beginning of the semiconductor shortage. There was a fire at Asahi Kasei in Nobeka, Japan, October 20th to be exact. And I'll tell you how effective supplier assessments play out on a day-to-day basis. We had a customer just north of Detroit, Michigan, so Eastern Standard Time. That fire was in the middle of the night, Eastern time. And that chief procurement officer is a good customer of ours. By the time his feet hit the floor in the morning, he had an alert on his smartphone that the fire took place. 13 of his suppliers were affected. His employees had already opened up our collaboration center. We're talking directly with the suppliers that were affected inside of our tool. We said, yes, are you affected? No, are you not affected? What's the effect on shipment dates? Are my current POs in flight going to be affected? They got all of that data, opened up a war room inside of our tool, and then the workflow module guided them towards what they should be doing based on these types of occurrences happening before. They were able to shift suppliers to another part of the world and didn't miss a beat on that catastrophe. These are the kinds of tools that are available today, and we're going to speak to some of them in some detail. So moving on here to the next slide, kind of an important slide. Whereas COVID is the preeminent attention getter, isn't it interesting that good old-fashioned fires every day, every week are exceeding the next catastrophe by almost a factor of 2 to 1. And frankly, Hirra, you're out there with our customers on a day-to-day basis. I'm sure we've never seen together a more calamitous year in our careers. But how are you seeing these data points on this chart affect customers' habits on a day in, day out basis? And what are they responding with as a result, and the industry as a whole, frankly?
Yeah, David, thanks for that question. I mean, short and sweet, it's been unprecedented. I mean, I've talked to clients, I've talked to prospects over the last couple of quarters really that have told me that what they've seen unfold in the past couple of months, past couple of quarters has been unprecedented. I mean, we've witnessed disruptions crunched in these past couple of months, even that they've experienced in over 2 decades. And all of that really at a global scale. I mean, you just mentioned some great examples. We've seen demand shifts, supply constraints, force majeures that came after of COVID, logistics nightmares. And the data seems to agree. The supply chain quarterly reports 97% of global enterprises experienced a major disruption to their supply chains in 2020. On our end, our Event Watch platform actually saw, and we just released our annual report, a 67% increase in supply chain disruptions reported last year, which is a total of 6,000 disruptions and nearly an 800% increase in supplier confirmations. So, I mean, it's definitely been, we're in uncharted territories, but what we've seen on the ground is customers and prospects that were interlocked with their suppliers. They had part-to-site visibility, access to recovery times, alternate site locations, those that were prepared with the data. They were able to make those data-driven decisions, navigate through these catastrophes, because we know risk is inherent. There's no such thing as a risk-free world, a risk-free supply chain. But what can we do to kind of prepare for those catastrophes and prepare for those disruptions so that we can emerge relatively unscathed?
Yeah, indeed, that's a great backdrop, Hirra. We appreciate that, being out there with customers every day. And look, folks, if you're expecting the catastrophes to end, you'll want to think again. I mean, it's just when you think it's safe to come out of the closet, we have another debacle like the Suez Canal. You may not know, but 52 ships go through that canal every day with 30% of the global supply chain. And by the time they got that freighter wedged free, there were 600 ships waiting to get through. And the next catastrophe is on its way, frankly. This just isn't going to end. In fact, it's so daunting that our own president, President Biden, put an executive order in place saying, hey, you've got to take better care of your supply chain. And the cost-effective tools are out there to do so. So why wouldn't you, frankly? What's the cost of not doing something at this point? So moving on to our next visual here. This is an example of our Event Watch tool for just 1 week in September of 2020. 202 events were recorded that could have an impact, low, medium, or severe, on everybody's supply chain on this phone right now. And the beautiful thing about this tool, just a sidebar, is it's context sensitive. So you can customize what types of alerts that you get based on the business that you're in, whether you want high, medium, or low. And we have the ability to cut out all of the white noise to help you with what you can do to get ahead of the curve. Now think of my friend up in North Detroit, our customer, the Chief Procurement Officer. If he hadn't pivoted on a dime and gone to a different part of the world, guess what? A lot of his competitors would have. That sends prices soaring, knowing that they're the few suppliers that are available to deliver those types of goods. So, and look, it may be a part that costs a nickel, but if you're shutting down a line of production, let's take General Motors just as an example. General Motors has published that for every minute one production line is shut down, that's $1 million. And they may be waiting on $2.50 O-rings or fuel filters from China, or pick your poison, right? So moving on to the next graphic here. This may seem like an esoteric question, but I put it in here for a reason. This maybe is the question. What is risk to you? Because we've observed in doing this for 10 years, that word means different things to different people. Maybe it's the risk of not having enough inventory. Maybe it's the risk of not getting free flow of your parts from different parts of the world. Maybe it's the financial risk of that particular supplier. Maybe it's the supplier that's a slow payer. Maybe it's the political unrest in the geo that the supplier is located. Risk means different things to different people. What if you had a tool that gave you a 360-degree view of risk? Why wouldn't you adopt that technology? User-friendly, great price performance, the avoidance of a catastrophe, and the list goes on and on and on. But this is the reflective question of the webinar. I'd like you all to just think and maybe jot down a few bullets. What does risk mean to your enterprise? If you're in insurance, it's something different than auto, something different than aerospace, something different than education, etc. Something worth reflecting on. So moving along. So this is just the GWOW chart, right? Look at these numbers, almost unthinkable as to what's going on in the business. As Hirra quoted earlier, 97%, some major disruption. 73% as a result planning large scale changes. And many of those are talking about reducing the globalization and turning more towards onshoring and localization. Easily said, very complicated to do, something that requires some fairly intense planning. A lot of the procurement executives polled said, hey, when will we be on variant 57, right? Look at the disaster that's happening to our brothers and sisters in India right now with their inability to deliver vaccines and their own variant. And of course, all of EMEA and APAC is concerned that that could spread onto the continents that they live on, et cetera. So some pretty daunting statistics here. Hirra, I would defer to you again. For those of our attendees that aren't doing supply chain assessments, I will say the people that do got out of 2020 relatively unscathed, right? The suppliers are mapped, the assessments are done, they have a good understanding of the risks, et cetera. But for those attendees that aren't doing it, how about a layman's definition of what is supply chain assessment and why is it important, whether I'm a GM or an IBM or I build bicycles in Secaucus, New Jersey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in layman terms, what a supplier risk assessment would be, it would be an evaluation of your supplier's processes, procedures, any risk characteristic really, to assess what risk they pose to your supply chain operations. So it's a standard way to collect this information so that at the time of a crisis, more proactively, you understand what exactly those risks are, and you can proactively mitigate those risks to create a resilient supply chain. And you're right, you don't have to be an IBM or a GM to know that this is important. If you've paid any raw material premiums in the last year, paid any premiums on freight, if you have a global supply chain footprint, which I know every industry, we see that across all industries, there is, you meet the criteria. You need to understand your supplier's characteristics, your supplier's operations, where your suppliers are located, what procedures and processes they have in place to withstand these disruptions of the world, and to proactively prepare. I mean, we see these scary statistics on the slide up here, and it really makes you think, have we lived through it all? Did 2020, was that the worst of the worst? But really not. It reminds me of a quote from Dr. Yossi Sheffi's book. He's a great professor at the MIT, his book, The Power of Resilience. And what he writes is, the past is bounded, but the future is unbounded. So we really need to prepare our supply chains for that unbounded future, for what's to come.
That's a great level set here. I love the quote as well. Those of you that don't read, that is one of the great Bibles you ought to tune into. So we talked about a 360-degree view of risk with your supply chain, your first tier, second tier, third tier suppliers. Keep in mind, you may be an auto business that purchases fuel filters for assembly in your plant, but that fuel filter is a tin can. It has paper inside of it from another place, and the pulp to make the paper comes from another place, and the trees to grow the pulp to make the paper to go in the tin can all come from different places. What if you had a tool that gave you 360-degree visibility of the risk with that entire chain? Not just fires, not just hurricanes or pandemics, strikes, riots, political unrest, geopolitical, economic, macro imbalance, mergers and acquisitions. We had one customer who the supplier got bought by another supplier, but there was a lawsuit with the second supplier and they had to abort on their primary supplier. So this kind of technology gives you that insight, and Hirra is going to talk about that in detail right now.
Thanks, David. What we want to bring up and highlight is the fact that risk, as we know it, is a data problem, and the lack of, really. With the increasing complexities of supply chains and just-in-times, it's absolutely pertinent to have more and more visibility of your supply chain, not just at the tier 1 level, but across multiple tiers, all the way down to the nth tier, and across multiple different initiatives. I'm sure many of us on the call today would agree that you're fairly confident about, who your tier 1 suppliers are, and at least have, we would say about 75% visibility on a few key risk factors, such as, where are they located, what are their financials look like, what is a sourcing profile, etc. But we really need to think about that 25%, and the other critical risk factors that we're not even considering. For instance, what cybersecurity threat does your supplier pose to your business operations? How sustainable are their practices? And as we dig kind of a layer deeper and we get into the sub-tier level, it gets more and more opaque. We have diminishing visibility as we get into the lower tiers, where the sub-tiers are located. Do they have alternate locations? Are they financially stable? Do they have the processes in place to maintain continuity of business if they're hit by a hurricane or a factory fire or any other man-made disruption or natural disaster? The reality is we have very less visibility, and ultimately, because of that, very less control over these risks. And the pandemic, for example, delivered a shocking lessons about the importance of these lower tier suppliers. Shortage of PPE, that taught us that, and it stemmed largely from the constraints on raw materials like filters and polypropylene. So it was not just the tier ones, but the interconnectedness and the dependencies on the tier twos that were providing these critical raw materials. So it all boils down to having that intelligence, having that data for us to take those proactive decisions more proactively and more predictively, so that we're able to, again, react and respond. So let me talk to you about a little bit about how we go about doing this. I mean, it sounds great, but it's not as easy as it sounds. It might sound like a daunting task. Where do we even get started? I have hundreds of sites. Where do I even start? I have limited resources. And that's the reality of it. Aside from the issue of lack of visibility, there's lack of resources, constraints on time, constraints on personnel. And therefore, even though many companies that we ourselves work with and prospects that we talk to, they're running some sort of supplier risk assessment, but they're often limited in their scope and in their effectiveness. And there's two reasons why. Typically, the task of assessing a supplier risk is dispersed throughout the organization. So you might have one team that's looking at CSR, another that's looking at the supplier's sustainability performance. There's no cohesive process when it comes to designing questionnaires, requesting information, reviewing the data that comes back, and then drawing conclusions to prioritize as a company which supplier risk to tackle first. So that's the first part of it, right? That dispersed activity throughout the organization. And secondly, because it's time consuming and resource intensive, we typically try to only prioritize the few critical suppliers, or the high volume direct suppliers are prioritized first. And we just talked about this. 80% of supply chains originate at the sub-tier level. So we need to come up and we need to use technology to allow us to bring this all together in one platform, have all these various different departments talking to each other so we can have one cohesive view of the supplier risk, put all the pieces together, and not just limit ourselves to those critical few. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides on how Resilinc helps you kind of approach that. So what's needed is really a solution, again, that integrates all the supplier risk assessments in one application. That one centralized platform where you can look at different risks for your suppliers, whether that's cybersecurity, business continuity, compliance, modern slavery, whatever is important to your organization, what you define as risk, as David highlighted. What is risk to you? From here, you want to weigh each risk factor by importance and then generate that risk score. So you're able to quantify the risk once it's identified and again, prioritize where you need to focus those mitigation efforts on. One of our long-term customers in the global technology space has implemented a unified risk assessment program that's tied to their key KPIs. We have another consumer products company that measures supplier CSR and sustainability performance and flags the non-compliance and supports the troubled suppliers to improve. So that's number one. Secondly, and most importantly, this needs to be a collaborative effort with the suppliers. And that means doing what we can to ease the burden and fatigue for the suppliers to complete these questionnaires. Resilinc calls ourselves the LinkedIn of supply chain. What do we mean by that? It is the ability for your suppliers to input that information onto the platform once, and then share that data with multiple customers without having to redo the work over and over and over again. It improves supplier sentiment, it reduces supplier fatigue. Suppliers, just like you and I, David, and everybody on this call today have a million things to do. Imagine them having to respond to individual requests from hundreds of different customers, all requesting the same data, the same visibility. Resilinc was built on the framework that of creating a supplier ecosystem to crowdsource that data, to allow approval-based sharing, and that's what we need to do in order to not start from scratch, to leverage the work that has already been done before you, because Resilinc has been doing this for the past decade. We have collected and we have established a relationship with over 200,000 suppliers that have input this information into the platform. So there's certainly no need to start from scratch. And then third but not last, is collaborate and take action. Once we've identified those hidden risks, how do we collaborate with the team internally, with our stakeholders, with the suppliers to initiate mitigation plans, all directly through the dashboard. So we don't need to work offline in Excel, in emails. It's all kind of pulled together in that one solution.
Hey, Hirra, David, interrupting you for a second, and forgive me, but I have a question the group may get something out of. The tool obviously seems very robust and does a lot. Let's say I don't want to do all of that. Let's say I just want a view of, oh, I don't know, I'm watching a commodity, gold, because I build semiconductors and that's the best conductant to put on the wafer. And all I want to do on the continent of Africa is monitor suppliers through a single view. What are their human rights violations? What's their sustainability? What I would call, I'm doing air quotes now, supplier, not only sustainability, but corporate citizenship. Can I do just a one view of, if I chose, select the own thing that I'd like to monitor and evaluate?
Absolutely, and I think that's important because if you start to look at everything that's happening under the sun, you're bombarded with irrelevant information, noise, so to speak. So with Resilinc, the ability for each end user, for each category manager to decide, again, what's important to them, what categories they're managing, commodities you mentioned, what suppliers are important, and what risk initiatives they want to monitor for those suppliers, what types of events are important for them. So the dashboard views, the alert system can all be tailored down to the end user, so that when your view is kind of just the risks that are important for you to monitor for those suppliers. If it's a region of Africa, that's exactly how it's going to be tailored for you.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you for that.
Sure. Moving along, I know we looked at this chart earlier in the presentation today, and we highlighted the fact that the #1 reported supply chain event in 2020 was factory fires. Close to 1,000 were reported. That averages about 2 to 3 fires a day. And when I was pulling this presentation together, I wanted to put all the factory fires that were just reported in April 2021, but I couldn't fit them all in one screen. So I had no choice but to put the last 10 business days of fires that were reported. That's 56 fires to be exact. But that's the sheer volume of factory fires that we see on a day-to-day basis. So I wanted to talk about the risk assessment and give an example and kind of put it in context to a factory fire, for instance. For those of you that don't know, for the customers that are not on the line today, what you see on the screen is the Event Watch mobile app. It basically allows you to keep track of global supply chain disruptions, events as they happen on the go in real time. Again, as I mentioned, the 56 fires that you see here last 10 business days of April alone. And these are the ones that hit public domain. The fact is that fires are hyperlocal, and oftentimes suppliers don't even report a fire incident. And although Resilinc does a great job scanning 3.5 million news sources, we scan across 100 global languages, some fires even go unreported, and you may not even feel the impact for weeks. Some fires have, result in regulatory changes. An example that comes to mind is in 2014, a fire at an automotive supplier in China that was caused by a combustible dust resulted in factory shutdowns weeks after. So it was not immediate, but weeks after. When the local government, they decided to inspect all facilities that were creating dust and shut down a lot of the factories for weeks to figure out what their dust mitigation plans were. So there's definitely a knockdown effect that can cause impacts in the future. And another thing to note is we can't rely on government regulations alone for these preventative measures. Fire preventions are highly variable, In Brazil, for example, companies are not even required to have sprinkler systems to operate. So really, can we rely on just government regulations to ensure that our suppliers have the right safety measures to ensure continuity of supply? So in the next couple of slides, I'll talk about what we do know. And because Resilinc has been collecting information on suppliers' BCPs over the last 10 years, we have amassed detailed BCP assessments, not only at the supplier level where the headquarters are, but at the site level, at the ground level. And our assessment, BCP assessment, is in line with the ISO 22301 standard. We have more than 35,000 unique site BCPs for suppliers. And what we know is that suppliers are simply not fully prepared to recover from things like factory fires or any other local disruptions that can damage equipment or their materials or their buildings. And frankly, this is concerning because many of us are blindsided when we assume that, I expect my supplier to take care of it. We fail to test their BCPs. And at least for those critical, high revenue impacting single source sites, it's important for us to have that visibility, for us to have that information. I mean, look at some of the stats that we see on this chart here. Almost a quarter report for fire and safety, 37% without even backup power. That's something that should keep us up at night. So I want to talk to you guys about some of the best practices that I've seen to kind of roll out the risk assessment process and some successful implementations, and I'll give some examples of that. So first and foremost, we need to start risk assessments with the suppliers. And over the next couple of slides, I'll show you some screenshots from Resilinc's technology on how we can streamline that process for you. But survey the suppliers, not just at the tier 1, getting into the sub-tiers as well. Those sub-tier suppliers whose parts and materials go into your most important products, we need to get that visibility. Time and again, we see those low spend suppliers in the sub-tiers, how they can derail production. The recent fire, July 2020, at the Japanese firm that makes fiberglass disrupted supply chains for ABS substrate producers, and in turn impacted kind of manufacturing of networking chips and CPUs. Another example of the disruption at the sub-tier with impacts to the tier 1 suppliers. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, you need to, as a company, come together to understand what is risk to you. We need to prioritize risk areas based on your business KPIs. Sustainability sourcing may be a higher priority for your organization than fire and safety, for instance. Financial health might take a backseat to cybersecurity. So what's important to you as a company to measure your supplier's risk? And then once we determine that, we need to align and place weights on each of those risk factors to be able to then measure, quantify those risks. Another thing is Resilinc can give you access to 10 years worth of event history for suppliers. So a great starting point would be to look at the suppliers in the hurricane-prone regions of the world, based on how vulnerable they are to hurricanes impact, and that's your starting point. Suppliers that are exposed to combustible dust or flammable liquids, we want to survey those suppliers for BCP. So there's a lot of data that is housed in Resilinc that you can access to start to then prioritize which suppliers we want to go after for what risk characteristics. Once we have that in place, we want to mitigate. So while sometimes identified risks are too expensive or it's too costly to mitigate, a lot of times what we want to do and best option is to collaborate, work with the supplier to reduce that unacceptable risk. An example, we've seen a customer pay to install sprinklers at a factory for fire suppression. And another customer that funded a retrofit for hurricane preparedness. We've seen in the industry customers that have created standards for suppliers in hurricane zones. They've agreed to pay more for raw materials if those suppliers invest in resilience. So, different measures that we can take to collaborate with suppliers to mitigate the risk. And then last but not least, of course, track and periodically refresh the risk assessments with the suppliers. It's not okay to just do it once and assume that we're good for the years to come. We recommend at least an annual refresh of these risk assessments so that you're sure that these suppliers are prepared, they have the right processes in place, and up-to-date capabilities, best-in-class capabilities to mitigate risk. Let me help you put it all together, and let me show you how it all works. So a couple of screens over the next couple of slides. So with Resilinc, you will get access to a library of surveys, a library of risk assessments. And this is not a stagnant library by any means. We have about 35 assessments in there today, but it continues to grow. As events of the world unfold, I mean, we just recently added the Suez Canal dependency assessment. It was added on 2 days after the ship was stuck in the Suez Canal. Solar winds, that's another one we recently added. So we continue to grow this assessment library so that you can leverage it. So that's first and foremost. You don't need to start from scratch. Leverage the questionnaires, leverage the assessment library that we have built. Take it, tweak some of the questions. You can add questions, remove some, change the weights on certain questions, or what you see on the bottom right of the screen, completely tailor it to your own requirements. So what's important to you? Drag and drop questions. Completely create your own. And then the ability to configure these surveys in over 30 global languages. In fact, in January, when our customers sent out the pandemic readiness assessment, it was launched to 3,000 suppliers in Chinese. So we want to talk the language of your suppliers in the region that they are in so that they're able to respond, again, going back to taking that burden, taking that fatigue off from the suppliers and improving supplier sentiment. So that's first and foremost, select what you want to assess the suppliers on, customize it to your business requirements. The next step would be for you to choose which suppliers you want to launch the assessment to. So you'll see in the platform, multiple multi-select filters are available for you to segment the suppliers you want to launch the assessment to, whether that's by category, it's by region, it's by supplier type. So again, filters segment the suppliers. The Resilinc interface will allow you to input the supplier recipient, customize the email template that the supplier receives. You can add attachments, such as your objective statements. Our customers add our letter of authorization that's usually signed by an executive sponsor on your side. So again, tailoring that the view for the supplier and configuring how you want to send that out. When the suppliers receive the assessment, they can engage with it at absolutely no cost to them. If they've completed an assessment for another customer in the past, again, going back to our LinkedIn model, they simply need to approve that access to you. So supplier X has completed a BCP, a business continuity planning assessment for a customer, a Resilinc customer. They simply need to go in and approve that access to you so that they don't need to re-input that information again. Once a supplier, if the suppliers, while they're completing the assessment, you can communicate with them in real time also. So we see that the inbuilt collaboration center works very much like a Slack or MS Teams. So when they're filling out the surveys, you have additional questions, you want to request additional information, maybe ask them to attach their VCP, attach any documents. You can chat with them. And it also actually creates a nice audit trail, a nice knowledge repository as well, all within the platform. So again, moving away from that Excel-based traditional methodologies. And once the assessments come back, here's where the fun happens. You get to see how they score on each of the risk areas based on the weights that you put on each of the questions. Each survey will have a score. Each risk area will have a dashboard where you can gain that instant real-time visibility into those risk areas. So you can understand high, medium, low, red, yellow, green, where those risks lie. On this screen here, for example, The supplier Tomei have responded relatively good on their BCP assessment. We're on a scale of 1 to 10. So 1 is low risk, 10 is high risk. So overall, their score is pretty low, but if you look at the different sections of the survey, it looks like they scored fairly poorly on the pandemic section, for instance. So I know for Tomei, for example, that's the area that I need to work with the supplier or collaborate with them on mitigating risk in that specific area. And it's all tied back to, again, the mitigation and the workflow. So we want to tie it end to end, not just identifying the risk, not just giving you the analytics, but the ability and the tools to be able to bring the team together, your team internally, to work with the suppliers. So the mitigation module will allow you to automatically assign actions within the team, end-to-end visibility on who's responsible for what action, what the progress looks like on each of those mitigation actions within that project, and to be able to centrally monitor those activities all in one dashboard.
So here, David, again, in wrapping this all together, it seems like the tool does a lot, various modules, rather complete. Do you all help me with training, educating my people? How about someone to ensure that I'm going to be successful in this journey? How does that all work?
Yes, so of course you'll have a customer success manager that's assigned to you, that it's tied to you by the hip, really, right? So their goal in life is to make your program successful and to keep your program alive. Of course, that's there. And they'll share best practices with you about how other customers have implemented this in the past. What are some ways that we can roll this out successfully? But we also have a team of partner relations specialists that work with the suppliers one-on-one on a daily basis, train the suppliers, and ensure that those questionnaires are completed. So there's flexible options with Resilinc. You can decide to leverage the managed services that we have, our supply relations services that we have. Again, they're global, speak various different languages, speak to the suppliers in their time zones, or you can decide to run these assessments on your own. The capability, the software has the capability for you to self-serve and self-assess your suppliers. Do that, do Resilinc, or do a hybrid option. Say, I have a great relationship with these 10, 20, 50 suppliers. I can manage these on my own. Help me go after the other 300.
Thank you.
Great, and if we can wrap it up with maybe some next steps on, we talked about what the technology does for existing customers, what you can do to get started. You already have your data in the system, your suppliers are loaded, the contact information is there. You simply want to go in and select which suppliers you wanted to assess for what risk initiative, configure the message, and launch to your suppliers. That's for our existing customers. And for the new folks on the line, it's a matter of loading your suppliers' information in, loading their contact information, and again, same steps as is for our existing customers. It's a 3-step process, very simple to get going. As I mentioned, self-serve within the platform, or use our customer success team, use our partner relations team that has been doing this for the past 10 years. So we have a proven methodology to work with the suppliers to get this information in, and the analytics populated on your dashboards.
To
so
me,
that, Melissa, yeah.
Yeah, to me, it's the old adage, 1,000-mile journey starts with a single step, right? And these steps are certainly doable. Again, think about the cost not to implement this type of protection for your enterprise. So thanks for that great summary there.
Melissa, I'm going to hand it back to you to see if we have any questions from the group.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Hirra, and thank you, David. And we did have a couple questions come in, so we'll get those answered. If you have any, again, please use the question tab to send those in. So we did have one from a current customer asking, are these templates available now, or are they add-ons to the current subscription? And then a follow-up to that, is there navigation available on the home page to where we can find them?
Yeah, so for existing customers, if you are our multi-tier customer in the multi-tier product or our Risk Shield Premium product, you should have the assessment module in your orgs. It is available on the home screen. We'll be happy to, maybe Melissa, if we can team down that customer contact, we can have our customer success manager reach out and walk them through exactly how they can navigate. But it's accessible through the home screen. The assessment library is available to you to launch and leverage, or create your own templates as well.
Super. Thank you. Yeah, and then so we'll go ahead and follow up with the person that asked that question. Next question that came in: what areas would you say are the most important to assess? I know we talked a lot about, factory fires being a huge event this past year, but what would you say, people should be assessing their suppliers for?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to something that David talked about. It's really about understanding what risk is to you. So that might look different for one customer than the other. So it's really to understand what risk characteristics you want to measure for your suppliers. I think a BCP is a great one to have under your belt, because it covers a lot of different risk areas. As I mentioned, the BCP assessment is based off of the ISO standards, so it ranks suppliers on their communication, their backup power, things that you would need to know for your suppliers if there was an earthquake, a hurricane, a factory fire. So that kind of takes care of a lot of those different event-related risks. But certainly, if there's other risk criteria that are important, such as sustainability or compliance or quality, it really matters to understand what's important to you as a company to assess, and then weigh those into the supplier risk scorecards.
Super, thank you. I had another one that came in also related to factory fires. Are these actually doubling, or is it because we are just having more visibility into disruptions and doing a better job of tracking? I don't know if, David, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I will. I don't think it's so much that they're doubling. They've always been there. So there's a bit of both, right? We do have better visibility. We are harvesting this information from around the world, so the volumes sometimes are excessive. However, the important thing to note here is that they're almost twice the disruptive factor than the number 2 disruptive factor. So it's something you certainly have to have your arms around, not only from your first tier suppliers, but on down the chain to second tier and third tier. Again, I'll refer to that great example that I gave. If you're buying fuel filters, it's a simple device, but the componentry comes from different parts of the world. And you're going to need to understand, what if there was a forest fire in that Javanese country that makes the pulp, that makes the paper that goes into the filter? So this is a solution that offers you not only visibility, but the ability to act on it, right? And where we're taking this market is not just, I want visibility and I want the data. Where the market is headed is, I want predictive information and then prescriptive information. What should I do about it? And I want it to be cognitive. So think about this solution set being built on an artificial intelligence, machine learning, neural network, heuristic engine that is constantly learning from all of the experiences that you're having. And as a result, developing better actions, better playbooks. So if you experienced a hurricane this year, you're going to be all the smarter on that action next year.
Super, thank you. Another question came in regarding, how hard is it to actually get suppliers to respond to these surveys? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, I can take that. So how hard is it for suppliers to respond? Honestly, it's going back to the LinkedIn model. We already have thousands and thousands of suppliers on the network that have completed these risk questionnaires. So we did not start the effort yesterday. It's been years of work that has gone into it, us hand-holding the suppliers to put this information in. So for the suppliers, it's relatively easy, and they prefer this over traditional methods because, again, it's the same questions or the same risk insights that multiple customers are requesting from them. So for them, it's a matter of going in and sharing that data with other customers that are requesting it. So that's kind of your low-hanging fruit. And what I always advise for customers, when I ran the global customer success team, it was when we worked with new customers, it was give us a list of your suppliers. Let us do a supplier match and tell you how many of those suppliers are in our network, how many of them have completed BCPs, how many of them have completed mapping assessments. And the supplier assessments that we yielded were honestly at many times alarming. We had 70 to 80% of their suppliers already engaged in the platform, already provided that information. So those are the low-hanging fruit. For the remaining, those are the ones that we're going to go after, develop those relationships, get them registered, onboarded, and have them complete the assessments.
Thank you. Another question came in. Do we have a way to audit if those contacts, the supplier contacts, are still current? How do we know that?
Sorry, Melissa, audit the supplier contacts?
Yeah, just I guess to make sure if the suppliers are current and if their assessments are accurate and current.
So supplier contacts, the way that we can audit that is, I know with our existing customers, we for each assessment, we can leverage contacts also. So we know with company, which contact at that company has responded to these assessment, is engaged with us, is constantly responding to the event alerts, etc. So there's definitely the advantage and the benefit of leveraging contacts. But also the refresh of the data does not necessarily need to come from the customer. The suppliers have control over this data, so they can, because it's supplier provided information, they own the data. So they can simply go in and update that information, whether that's a new contact that we need to work with, or just updating any of the risk insights that they provided on their assessments. They can do that on their end themselves as well.
Super. And kind of a follow-up to that, what is the retention period for partner assessment responses?
Retention period for the assessment responses. So with Resilinc, meaning, Melissa, just to clarify, is that how long would it take for an assessment to come back, or how long is it? I'm assuming,
yeah, that's what that means. Yeah.
So typically without Resilinc, it can take up to 2 years for a supplier to respond to a survey, and that's what we've seen in experience. It also depends on what level of information you're requesting from the supplier. In my experience, I've seen it's typically between 6 to 8 weeks with Resilinc that it takes to get this information back from the supplier. Of course, it can be sooner. Talking about those suppliers that have already completed the assessment, for them it's relatively much easier, but those that are not, typically takes about 6 to 8 weeks for those assessments to come in. Okay, but it's important to know, as the suppliers are completing the assessments, they don't need to complete 100% of the questionnaire for that information to populate in your orgs. As the information is being saved, so say they worked on 70% of the assessment or 70% of the questionnaire, that data and analytic will start to flow in your org. So we don't need to have it either on or off. It flows in as the suppliers are completing the assessment.
Super, thank you for that. Another question that came in is related to sub-tier visibility. So can Resilinc solution help me identify critical suppliers in order to achieve sub-tier visibility? How do you recommend? I'm assuming that would be more about our mapping solution. So I don't know if David, you want to take that one quickly?
No, I would defer to Hirra on that one, Melissa, only because it implies a couple of things, both mapping and a window into the tier beyond first tier, and Hirra deals with that every day.
Super. Yeah, so absolutely. So the supply chain visibility survey, that's our bread and butter. That's what we do. That's what we've done for many, many customers. And again, not just getting that visibility to the tier 1, but getting into the tier 2, tier 3. So the way that would roll out is when you send the questionnaire to the supplier, requesting them to map out where the parts are coming from, where their locations are, where their alternate locations are, you're also requesting them to provide sub-tier information. So who are your sub-tier? Who are your suppliers? Where are they located? Where are their sites? What are their contact information? So it's working. You can either, there's 2 ways to do this. Work with the tier 1 to get to the tier 2 and so on, or work directly or survey the tier 2s directly to get information, and then from there move to tier 3. So there's two ways that we can skin the cat, and we've seen that successfully, both ways done that very successfully.
Super, thank you. And then I had one last question come in, and this is more related to monitoring and just how our monitoring solution works. But how soon can a customer or a prospective customer start receiving alerts for supply chain disruptions? How quickly can someone get up and running?
Literally 24 to 48 hours, because it's only a matter of you providing us a list of your suppliers. We can augment that data with publicly mined information. We have information about supplier site locations. So all we need is a list of your suppliers. If you would like to give us the sites, that's great. If not, we can still turn on the event alerts so that at least you can start that event monitoring, the detection of the global events that may be impacting your suppliers.
Super, thank you. Okay, I think that's going to wrap things up today. Those were great questions and a great presentation. Thank you again to David and Hirra, and to our audience for attending today. We will be sending out links to the recording and presentation deck, so please be on the lookout for that. And if you have any questions, you can email sales@resilinc.com, or again, look for our follow-up emails, and you can respond to us that way as well. So I hope everyone has a great rest of the week, and we hope to catch you on the next webinar. Thanks so much.